Hi. It's fantastic to see so many people. And look, I'd like to firstly say thank you to Architecture Media for making this happen. I think it's a really unique premise for a discussion about architecture. It's fabulous. And I'd also like to thank Brian for making the time to come along. And Callum as well. It's great that you guys could come and be involved. And it's also nice to see Peter here too, because he's actually experienced the house as part of the jury, so that's great. So Arm End is the name actually came from the old farm. Most of South Arm was owned by the Calvert family, and there used to be this old gate, literally near to where Brian and Veroni's house is, that just had Arm End on it. And I remember going down there as a young guy and seeing this gate. So when Brian and Veroni showed me the land, I just thought, well, it's a fitting title. And I'd like to acknowledge tonight Ben, who is here, and Ben worked really side by side with me on this project, and it was a wonderful meeting of the minds, and we really enjoyed working together. I hope we get to do so again. We became great friends. And also acknowledging the fact that throughout Tasmania, there really is a significant amount of Aboriginal history, and it's quite evident in artefacts all over the place, and particularly on South Arm. Brian and I have ridden out there on our bikes, and you literally can just come across middens all over the place. So, and to some degree, that informed the approach, as did my history of growing up in Tasmania camping, which really is quite informative in terms of living in that almost impermanent way, that fringe between it being a shelter and almost not being there at all, and more about being outside than inside envelope. And just talking briefly, very quickly, about just fabric and context and scale, and the Tasmanian shack, and which I think is very much under threat. And for me, it's that nuance and that atmospheric condition of the classic shack, which is almost architecture without architects, and it's this scale of it and the sense and atmosphere, and the opportunity for personalisation, that really makes shacks unique to that particular person, and proportion in terms of, often with shacks the site is far more dominant than the actual building itself. And the opportunity to just be secluded and daydream, and I think that's particularly relevant in terms of when initially talking to Brian and Veroni, that they had very hectic and busy lives, and it's not that they wanted to necessarily escape that. I don't think that's the case, Brian, was it? It was more that you just fell in love with Tasmania.
It was an inexorable draw. Well, obviously, my wife, Veroni, and I, Veroni is from Sri Lanka, so she grew up in that culture, and then I'm American, and we actually met when we were living in different cities, and we converged upon New York and lived there. And we've traveled all over the world, but very early in our relationship, we came on a trip to Tasmania, and we just really fell in love with it and said, let's move there. But of course, there was really no context for moving there. It took us about 10 years to do it. But finally, we actually did it. And that's unusual because a lot of people come there and say that they want to live there. Like, for example, Agatha Christie is one of them. And Charles Darwin wanted to. And here's an really interesting thing I just heard the other day. I met a guy who said he was really close friends of George Harrison. And he said that George Harrison wanted to move to Tasmania, but couldn't do so because he decided he was actually in the process of getting ready to move to Tasmania, but then a lunatic came into his house and stabbed him, and he had been cancer-free, but that stress of that brought the cancer back, and then he had to attend to that, so he couldn't actually make the move to Tasmania. So I kind of feel like a sense of irony that George Harrison, from the greatest rock band of all time, wanted to do what I was actually able to do.
This is actually true. A friend of mine was a luggage guy at the casino there at the Rest Point, and way back in the 80s, I think Harrison visited and stayed there, and he found himself in a lift with him, but Harrison was pretty disguised, and as he went up in the lift, this friend of mine said, "Oh, so what do you do with yourself?" And the reply was, "Oh, I used to be in a band once."
I will say that Graham Kennedy used to live down the road from our place.
Fantastic. But I think also that those previous slides about this idea of getting away and seclusion and just being able to daydream, and it very much translates into what our homes and what our places that we reside in, I think, can be, and that's places just to lose ourselves, that total privacy to just completely relax and be right-brained. And I think that what we see happening so often, and particularly in Tasmania a lot, is that the coastal fabric is being significantly eroded by the onset of the march of materialism and even the way we relate in our homes is becoming typically segregated and internally focused, and in many respects coastal homes are starting to govern what is the public domain, and should there be this sort of supremacy over the landscape. And so, and look, the irony of this is that this building here is actually quite near to Brian and Veroni's house. And, I, on a number of occasions, and I think you as well, Brian, a couple of times, have had people sort of come up and say, "Oh, you did that building for Brian, that's right out on the point, it's got that kind of twirly brass thing." And, so... and it's like, no, so I think, was it...
It's one of Brian's instruments.
Yeah. It was one of the ministers, I think. Even
tells you what they think of us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is. It's about this sort of presumption that is a rock star's house. Anyway, but I think really, what it is and can and possibly should be about is really just manipulation of light and the subtle control of space and inviting the landscape in, and that blurring of the edges. And so they're the premises on which we move forward into this project. And look, it was a real privilege. Brian, you can perhaps say a few words about this. But when I was approached by Brian and Veroni, at first when I spoke to him on the phone, I didn't realise who he was. But it took me a while to work it out. But there was this wonderful brief that was just so succinct and had this humility about it. That, there wasn't this foisting this sort of oversized brief that I had to try and cull back, which is often the case.
How did you find out about Stuart when you got to Tasmania?
It was an interesting process to find an architect because we bought this land from Peter Garrett, Peter from Midnight Oil, and as foreigners, we didn't know that there was a law that said that you must start construction within 2 years of buying property in Australia if you're a foreigner. So we just thought we'll sit on this land and we'll just do something with it later. And in fact, we couldn't do that. So we had to find an architect, and of course I was touring and we were too busy to make a reconnaissance trip just to find an architect. So we did it the old-fashioned way, looking around on the internet. And Stuart wasn't the only person we contacted. We contacted a few people, including this guy, Jim Jones, who actually lives right down the block from us until recently. He moved here. And he just ignored it. He thought it was a hoax or something. what we were planning to do is make a short list and then meet with a few people. But talking to Stuart, he was like, so why are you moving to Tasmania? How did you first come to Tasmania? And then he realized who I actually was, because he had seen the band play and even bought an acoustic bass similar to mine after being inspired by that.
He wanted to become you.
Yeah, he wanted to. Well, all architects want to be musicians, and most musicians don't know what architecture is about. But anyway, so Stuart. So when I found out Stuart was a fan, I thought, okay, he's the guy, because he'll work extra hard. But the truth is, then we met with Stuart, and the idea was to just kind of find the common aesthetic, because we had specific ideas. We weren't going to try to tell the architect what to do, but we did have certain parameters that we wanted to work within. So we brought in a pile of books into Stuart's office, and then Stuart said, well, I have prepared some books for you to look at that kind of represent where I'm coming from. And we said, yeah, we've got these books and they were the same books. So we thought there was some mutual sympathy there.
Yeah, and look, I think too, it was just wonderful to be able to, it's quite an eclectic combination, if you like, with Brian and highly regarded entomologist, and I was really intrigued by that, and I have a musical background as well, and so there was a nice synergy there, and we just moved forward on that basis. And
so, Stuart, has the Song of Thanks been written yet?
No. It will be. That'll be a collaboration, maybe. But look, these are some of the earliest site photos that were taken, and there's this fantastic log that just keeps moving around. It's still there, isn't it, Brian?
It's back. It's
back, yeah. So it's huge. It's sort of this big, and we go down and have beers on this log, but it kind of drifts out to sea and then comes back in on the tide a week later, but this beautiful silvered object sitting on the beach was lovely, and automatically just drawn to this tapestry of the she oaks, which are slightly different species of casuarina, and the site was really quite open and quite windy. South Arm is very windy indeed when it blows westerly, being on the western shore of the Derwent, and so I was quite conscious of that. Quite conscious that the opportunity, in fact, was. I was immediately drawn. I visited the site with Veroni first, and I immediately walked right down to the she oaks and said, we've got to put the building up here, not only just for practical thermal protection reasons, but also there was this wonderful opportunity for this articulation of light with the western sun, and there's a couple of notes here on the brief. You can check those, Brian. Is that right? But there was this very succinct, quite straightforward brief, which was lovely. Brian's interest in simple technology, things that aren't overly complex. Zen house, which is interesting, going back to my interest in Japanese pavilions, and I did a lot of reading as a student of Japanese spatial hierarchy, and also the Pirates Bay House, which was an earlier project which they had referenced, and in fact,
yeah, we saw that on the internet, and we thought it was worth calling Stuart on the basis of that design.
We ended up going down there and having coffees in that building sort of fairly early on, and again, sort of this whole thing of a beautiful photo of Ben's there up in the top left, but. There are a number of aspects to this site. There is the opportunity for rather than actually, again, governing the coast, because this, in summertime, is effectively a public promenade down there. And so we thought, there's an obvious, you can either govern that or stand over it, or we can pull back behind the trees. But that, in fact, denied the view, this grander view, but it refocused at 90 degrees over this kind of Tuscan-like vista to the north. So, it was a philosophical and practical decision to do that. I mean, I'm not sure as a client how you felt about saying, look, you're going to be denied the view.
At first, it was a little unsettling to think that there could be this beautiful view of the water, but it was obscured by the trees. However, now we've completely turned around to thinking that we would not want to have an unobstructed view because the trees are so beautiful. It creates a kind of psychological and also physical buffer zone. Also, practically, it's good to block the wind. But really, they're beautiful trees, and it's like, they're alive, and you can really interact with them.
And the sound.
Were you able to, seems like one of those sites where you probably want to be able to spend some time, get some affinity with the land. Were you able to spend time there, or stay overnight, or did you do anything like that to kind of hone your brief?
Yeah, we hung around there quite a bit.
Yeah.
Stuart, I think, stayed there for several days just to see the way the winds went and so forth.
Yeah, I often go to sites and just listen to them. I think you learn an enormous amount just by sitting there and listening. The sound of the wind through the she oaks is, there's an Tasmanian Aboriginal word for it is Ritchie, and it's that beautiful drifting sound. And I thought there's a real opportunity for the building to actually be opened up and bring that sound in. So some of the earlier shots, and again, you can see that thing of the beach as a discovery and walking through this grove of she oaks down to the shore where you can sort of fosk among the rocks and swim. And you still swim all the time now?
I swam this morning.
Oh,
yeah,
cool.
It was cold.
Yeah. For people from Queensland, it's always cold, but for Tasmanians, maybe not. But look, my interpretation of that brief was really that it was a building of humility, restrained planning, low scale, intimate, and I very much picked up on the site that there's just going to be howling winds here at times, and so that one side of the building really had to be like a fortress, and the other side can just open up and just let the light just flood in, so there's protection and openness, and the building just letting it weather naturally. So some of the earlier sketches there, an early model, just to give a sense. And a lot of the, I'll just run through some of these images because a lot of the time Brian was touring and they still hadn't actually moved to Tasmania, so we were emailing images and things just to give an impression. And, as opposed to the Pirates Bay House, which is quite, bold in its suspension through the air, this was just quite subtly semi-buried into the site again to give some protection and that sequential experience of site as you move through the site, so coming down and then dipping down to the entrance and then out to the trees. And some of Ben's lovely little impressionistic images, which I love Mies van der Rohe's images where he would literally only show the landscape. He'd just have these open, folded out images that he'd do and present to clients, and this is some of the things that we were presenting to Brian and Rooney to say, hey, we could have this little outdoor fire and things. And the design very much, evolved as we went in detail, and in fact an entire wing got added on sort of midway through the process, which is... So construction started and we freaked the builders out a couple of times by going down and for those of you who don't know, Brian is a shakuhachi flute master and it's a Japanese flute, and on a couple of occasions came down and actually played on the site, and I'm banging on a cajon there, and that was fun. It was good. I mean, you don't do that often with clients. It's
should be more of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we just...
What the clients...
and soaking ourselves in the site, and I think the site liked it as well, and I'm not sure what Scott and Neil, the builders, thought of it. But we'd do this and then have meetings, you see, and it'd just chill them out. So but I must say that the builders Caudle Lane, Scott Caudle and Neil and his team were just fantastic fabricators of what really is a jewellery box, and it required that precision, and they were precision builders, so that they had a very big hand in this. Neil himself, something right up at the top of the site would line up absolutely perfectly with something right down the other end, and it was fantastic to walk onto site and just go, it's all good, without sort of having to run around and point things out. You just were able to trust, and that's also pretty rare. So the tectonics of the building, essentially, again, that southern side being concrete, and concrete itself is quite massive, and it was boarded up with heavily sandblasted Oregon. We actually chamfered the edges and sandblasted the edges to create this ribbing effect. And the precast guys did an incredible job of the panels, but they did all these samples, and Builder and I were going out, and they were always too perfect because I wanted them to be crumbly and a little bit rough, and so I'd say it's great, but it's just too good. Can you make it rougher? And we, but eventually they really nailed it. It was fantastic. It's a great texture.
It's hard to specify bad workmanship.
That's right. Well, we had, I think when we were sorting, the guy who came to fill the tanks up, at the end he came up and he looked at it and he goes, "Is that the toothing for the render?" And so yeah, it is. It's tricky to actually get that rawness. So moving into the building now, just conscious of time, but these. Again, this sort of personalisation and that enrichment of the building through those things that make it about the person who is living there, and there was no shortage of that. Having a client like Brian and Veroni, that enormous set of books. I don't think you've only got half of them in there, haven't you? And and Brian always wanted a gong at the front door, which is just fantastic. Do people ring it often?
Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Some people don't. They knock on the door, and then I say, "That's the doorbell."
But also we worked on, trying to move away from the building being about, just a kit of parts and just specifying products. And so, we said, again, this is where the builder was fantastic. And I just said, look, it'd be great to have this big copper rod as a door handle on the front door, and so Ben and I started working out how that might work, and we were just sort of working out fixtures and things, and the premise behind that was that Brian and Veroni are quite different heights, and that where over time copper weathers, and where they'd put their hands would actually weather, and then so the point of entrance of the building would hopefully become about them and no one else. So I'm not sure whether it's working, but
we use the side door.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Okay. That's all right. Well, so do I. But yeah. So but again, sort of being able to. Little Ben sketch there, and sitting down together over coffee, just working out how the hell this thing would go together, and whether or not Scott would be able to take it off to his steel eater. But they did, and sort of it was this beautiful collaboration of skills on all levels, so and things like this, which Carlo Scarpa is, I'm in awe of Scarpa and the way he applies this richness to his buildings. So with what we had, we were trying to do a little bit of that. And another example of this is the library, and I mentioned that Brian and Veroni have this absolutely huge collection of books, but there was a limited scope in the size of the building, and so we really couldn't afford to have a whole other room devoted to books, and we didn't want to. So how did we do that? So the the idea was to make the entrance hall the library. And I started thinking about really, who my client's connection to music, and thought, well, perhaps there's something in this. And so I started sketching musical notation and thought that might actually set up the opportunity for how something might work. And, sat down with Ben's brother, Charlie, is just a fantastic joiner. And Ben said, hey, we can get Charlie to do this, it'll be fine. And I think Charlie actually pulled out of it, and we ended up getting the builder's joiner. But we worked quite closely together, Ben and I, on this, and started to Ben's lovely images, and he reduced my mad concept to something systematic, which was wonderful. And the result hopefully being that somehow this would be an abstraction of musical notation as you walk down the hall, and be something about the client as they actually walk into their main space. Now, Brian, you were talking earlier on about shutters. Remember, we were talking about having wind shutters because of how windy it was, and we just sort of sat there and we knew that this wasn't going to work, and I was worried about things just going bang. And so again, we sat down with the builders and came up with the option of having these kind of shutter-like grills on rollers that you can actually physically go out and move. And they're a little bit experimental, but I think that there's again a really important role in architecture is to push things a little bit and see whether things do work. That experimental edge. These kind of work, and they're really interesting though. But you can actually go out and change the facade of the building. I don't know whether you do that. Do you do it?
Yeah. It's interesting because of course buildings, they don't tend to move, but we can have this one element that we can move around and change the look of the building.
Was there any other? I'm interested in any other specifics in the brief to do with music, like in terms of acoustics, or it was sort of an area where it didn't really want to sort of go and draw from too much in terms of creating a space.
The contrary, because in the past, my homes have always ended up looking like pawn shops filled with musical debris. So this time we just wanted to have a house that we would live in, and I have my studio elsewhere. So we didn't think about that. Otherwise, in the past, I would have always want to have a studio in the basement or whatever.
Yep.
And this time we decided not to go the music route.
Yeah, and it's a pretty rational pavilion. But look, from my perspective as an architect, I was really conscious of the fact that my clients were coming from the other side of the world to make this place their home, and so I was really conscious of that and wanted a building that actually felt warm and felt like a home as soon as they occupied it, and as opposed to being too stiff and shiny and so again this protection and openness and the fireplace being the hearth or the place of congregation, and again harking back to those camping experiences and this being about the campfire of the house. And I mean, we had that party recently, and we cooked on it. It was great. You can open it up and you actually use it. So it really is the campfire of the house, and then you can sort of sit around it and things. And
this fireplace, there are only two in Australia. The other one is here at the Sofitel.
Yeah.
Is it? Yeah. Well, we have the wood burning. I'm into burning stuff. So yeah, we cook on that, and we decided not to go for the gas version.
Yeah, and the gas version was going to be a bit of a headache, but it was really hard getting anyone to actually install it.
It was ridiculous. Like we even contacted the people who installed the one at the Sofitel, and they wanted something like $5,000 to come and install this. And finally, we got a tip that we should call barbecues galore in Hobart, and we did. And this guy came in, and he looked like
He looked like he just stepped
like
out
he
of
wasn't
Woodstock.
really into French design, you know. And he just looked at it, looked at the diagram. Doesn't look like a heater, but it's a heater. I think I can handle this. And he charged like $300.
Yeah, he did. And there was, Brian and him, and he literally looked like he'd walked straight out of Woodstock in '68. But he was, and it was him and Brian and I were all sort of like this, trying to fit this thing into the roof, but because it suspends from the structure in the roof. But look, it's really lovely because you can actually fling the building open in summer, and it really does become, like the campfire, even outside. And the building is weathering instrument. I've got to rush through these now. And again, even the transition between levels, and here just having raw blackwood sitting there like that, which is very much about that acceptance of weathering and that Japanese philosophy of wabi-sabi that with age comes beauty, and the tactility of raw in situ concrete as opposed to sort of specifying some product for the kitchen. And the beautiful table done by Ben's brother, Charlie, and out of solid Tasmanian blackwood. And we even, it was just wonderful working with clients who were going to honour right through and do things like, to the extent of a letterbox. And, it's not often that this happens, and, we're able to do a blackwood bed, which, in a house like this warrants having these elements and is really, it's enriched by them.
All the timber's sourced locally. The firewood as well, I don't know.
Yeah, everything, the firewood actually comes a lot from sort of whatever falls, doesn't it? And you do get some in. And this is celery top, which salvaged celery
or
top.
Or sassafras.
Sassafras door, Tasmanian sassafras, which is extraordinary timber. Black heart.
Which I became familiar with because back in 1984, Maytone, the venerable Australian guitar manufacturer, gave me a bass made out of that. So I really like that wood. Sounds good.
And so really there's a couple of, Brian's fantastic pump organ which sits there, and, these are just fantastic collectibles that, sit as artifices in the middle of this sort of fairly rational space. It's great. And just a couple of quotes to finish. Some of you may have read The Architecture of Happiness, and I think that even though architecture is a silent thing, it does speak to us, and it often speaks to us about, and particularly if it's our own building, and a building of this nature, it speaks to us just as much about how we want to feel and reminding ourselves about who we are. And I think it's really with only through the removal of those material aspects that we often baggage ourselves with on a day-to-day basis that really buildings are allowed to just be and let the architecture speak. And ultimately on a site like this, it's the landscape. As a mentor of mine said years ago, as soon as you place architecture in the Tasmanian landscape, it's ultimately engulfed by it. It's so domineering and so powerful, the landscape down there and the light. So there's no point in trying to compete. You've just got to pull back.